Major funding for aging matters is provided by the West End Home Foundation, enriching the lives of older adults through grant-making, advocacy, and community collaboration. The Jeanette Travis Foundation, dedicated to improving the health and well-being of the Middle Tennessee community. The HCA Foundation, on behalf of TriStar Health. Cigna, together all the way. Additional funding provided by Jackson National Life Insurance Company, the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, and by members of NPT. Thank you.
As the U.S. prepares for the November 3rd, 2020 presidential election, Tennessee will play a prominent role. On October 22nd, Belmont University hosts the third and final presidential debate. With the nation turning its eyes to Nashville, NPT is directing attention to the policies and issues that matter to older adults and what the mechanics of voting will look like under the circumstances of the pandemic. Adults over age 65 vote at higher rates than any other age group and make up nearly 25% of the electorate. So, what drives older adults to the polls, and how are they shaping the political future of the country? Here to join us in this conversation are Bill Sweeney, Senior Vice President, Government Affairs at AARP, Rebecca Kelly, State Director of AARP Tennessee, Kanika Young, Senior Director of Health Policy and Advocacy with the Tennessee Justice Center, and Pat Nolan, News Channel 5's political analyst, as well as Marion Ott, President of the League of Women Voters of Tennessee. Thank you all for joining us. We also spoke to Dr. Robert Hudson, Professor Emeritus of Social Policy at Boston University, and I wanted to start our conversation with a comment from that interview.
If you go back again 2 or 3 decades, older people voted less than any other age group. Today they vote more than any other age group. There were obviously fewer of them around, and now there are a lot more. In 1960 there were 18 million, today there are 54 million. Older people today constitute in a presidential election upwards of 25% of the electorate, whereas years ago it would have been more like 10%. So it's an enormous increase. And then older people vote much more readily than other people in the adult population. We have roughly, on a consistently older people, about 70-75% of them vote in a presidential election, compared to people in their 20s who tend to vote roughly between 20 and 30%.
And now to our panelists, what does higher voter participation from older adults mean for the country?
Well, I'll jump in. When we look at the percent by population of who's registered and who's voting, the clear winners are the people 65 and older, which means that the younger people are ceding to their elders the choice of government. Of course, as the president of the League of Women Voters, that makes me sad. I'd like to see really, really high, if not 100%, registration and voting across the board.
I can't quote the exact numbers, but Metro's always had a problem in its local elections, particularly for mayor, of getting any kind of large turnout. We vote over 250,000 for president, and we're lucky to vote 100,000 for mayor. And in the last couple of elections, particularly the senior vote has been a major part of the overall turnout. So it's very important, particularly in local elections. Perhaps that's because people see their local government as being something they're concerned about in terms of what it might do in terms of their taxes, what's going on their street, who's picking up their trash, what about the police and fire. So it's an important thing. And now that the boomers are getting older, perhaps they didn't vote as much when they were younger, but they do vote now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of shocking that it's almost 70% of older adults will actually turn out. And when we're talking about ages 20 to 30, it's in that 20 to 30% of folks will actually vote. I mean, why is that? What lessons are we learning as we age that bring us out to the polls?
Well, I think that one of the lessons that people learn as they get older is the importance of elections and the importance of voting, the importance of being civically engaged. And, for older voters, they really do make the difference. And election after election after election, it is older voters who decide who's going to win those elections. And that's why, candidates really need to focus on the issues that matter to older voters, things like Medicare and Social Security, health care and financial security. These are critical issues that really affect people of all ages, but especially older voters.
I was just going to echo and say, I think with age comes wisdom, and people realize as they get older that politics impacts everything in their lives, and they really recognize that it's important for them to have a say in their government and how their leaders are deciding issues that impact their daily lives.
Yeah, I mean, do we have a sense of what are those things that bring older adults out to the polls so much more than younger generations?
I think healthcare is a big issue. I think it's probably the elephant in the room, as older adults rely more heavily on our healthcare system, and a lot of the outcomes that they rely on and are influenced by politicians. They really want to make sure that their voices are heard in the programs such as Medicare, Social Security, as well as Medicaid to a larger extent these days. And I think because the Affordable Care Act has become so politicized, that's going to be something that should drive a lot of older adults to the polls this year.
I would just add that I think obviously we've proven that the older voter is the largest voting bloc, but it's not a homogeneous group. And I think it depends on whether you're retired or working, whether you're a grandparent raising grandchildren, how dependent you are on some safety nets like Medicare and Social Security. And so it really sort of is dependent on your own family circumstances.
Right. And, and also some of the demographics. I mean, again, we're talking about, as older adults, as that population grows, as the baby boomers are coming of age, now we're looking at almost 50 million Americans. It's interesting to think about, well, how does that demographic break down? And does that also play into preferences? Like my understanding is right now about 73% of older adults are non-Hispanic whites. And that group went mostly for Trump, President Trump in 2016, if that's correct. Pat, do you know?
Yeah, that is correct, and it seems to have evolved a bit differently for 2020, whereas President Trump carried the senior vote by double digits. Some of the nationwide polling, a Monmouth College poll that just came out that Newsweek has an article about, shows Biden ahead by double digits for seniors, so it's completely flipped around. Now, it may depend on how you define seniors. If you look at that Monmouth poll, in the 50 to 64 range, Trump still has a 7-point lead. So it seems to make a difference. And I believe Rebecca AARP has a poll in some of the battleground states that shows it very close. And of course, the battleground states are what's going to decide it, not what people think about it nationwide in terms of the popular vote.
That's right, which reinforces the fact that it depends on the circumstances, depends on the state, depends on who you are and what your family makeup is.
So, as we head towards a big national election, a presidential election, do policies, issues like Medicare, Social Security, to what extent do those issues still become relevant when it's really a lot of gut politics that seems to rule the day and control what is happening in the horse race, so to speak? Why is it so important to think about what actual policy changes will happen depending on how you vote?
Well, I would just argue that older voters are also educated voters. These are folks who spend a lot of time following the news, they know what's going on, and they are watching for people's issues. And it's not a monolith. This is a group of voters who you're right, they did vote for Trump in 2016. They also put Democrats in the Congress, in the majority in the House of Representatives in 2018. That swung. And so I think this is a group of voters who take this very seriously. They take their voting rights very seriously. They read up on candidates. They follow what people are saying. And I think it's really important for people who are running for office to really take this vote seriously and to make sure that they have serious and smart policy positions for older voters.
In terms of not being monolithic, even though Joe Biden may have a 10-point lead nationally, according to some of the polls with seniors, that doesn't mean he's going to get a 10-point lead among seniors in Tennessee. Obviously, there are other issues involved there, probably social issues, and Tennessee tends to be a very conservative red state, so by no means is the senior vote monolithic in any way.
So, when we're looking then at older adults, a population that seems to understand the civic responsibility around voting, that seems to care more about policy, what are some of those policies that people are really paying attention to and thinking about how that might impact the way that they vote when they head to the election?
Well, I think most people vote based on their pocketbook more than anything else. It's the economy stupid that we heard so back in Bill Clinton days. But when that's not in the forefront, in other words, if seniors don't feel that Social Security is being threatened, and that might be an issue in this race. It hasn't been yet, but certainly the president's done some things that might raise that as an issue. When that comes up, people may focus on that, and some of the other issues that they're concerned about, like safety or other things, may be a secondary issue. So I think that they're going to respond to what they see and hear from the candidates, what they see and hear in the media, that will help them guide what's most important to them when they go to the polls.
Along those lines, what do we know about the candidates and their platforms related to these policies like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, even infrastructure or caregiving supports? What do we know from the candidates on those issues at this point?
Well, in terms of the president, he has certainly talked about, in his first campaign, protecting Social Security and Medicare. But most recently around the pandemic, he has come in and declared a holiday on the payroll tax. Nobody in Congress seemed to want him to do that, but he did, and that money has been used now to help some people get some additional funding that they lost when the additional unemployment compensation went out. The problem is the money for the payroll tax goes to help fund Social Security. And the president plans to have Congress forgive that when people, because otherwise you'd have to pay it back. It's a holiday. It's not a complete forgiveness. Congress may not do that, and the president's also said if he's reelected, he plans to ask Congress to completely do away with the payroll tax. Well, that would pretty well take Social Security and put it on the fast track towards insolvency very, very quickly. Now, that has not been played up by either candidate one way or the other. If it does, I think it may tend to have a bigger impact on what seniors think about that and how they might vote, because certainly they're going to be concerned about anything that might create a problem for them in the future in terms of receiving Social Security.
Bill, I mean, the CEO of AARP actually wrote a letter to the president around this specific issue. Is that correct?
It is, and it's, the payroll tax does fund the Social Security. It funds the money, the trust fund, and without that trust fund, the payments can't go to people who need them. And so this is absolutely critical. And think about this: about half of older Americans rely on Social Security for either most or all of their income, and the average Social Security benefit is only $1,500 a month. So for our AARP members, Social Security is the issue. It is the pocketbook, but it is everything. And without Social Security, without the strength of that program, they don't have anything. And so that's a serious issue that we take very seriously. And to be honest, we have said the exact same thing to President Obama as we say to President Trump, which is leave the payroll tax alone. This is the way Social Security has worked for 85 years. Leave it be. We need to improve the system, not be picking at the payroll tax.
And Bill, I'll just add that in Tennessee, 90% of Tennessee beneficiaries of Social Security depend on that for more than 50% of their income. So significant.
And, also, I know I'm thinking back to, I believe it was 2010 when the Affordable Care Act there were some questions around that. And I believe it was the Republican Party had put in sort of a concern that if ACA went through, this would gut Medicare. And that turned out a lot of people to the polls, right? That actually, and whether that was true or not is up for conversation. But that dramatically brought out older adults, and they made a difference in that election, correct?
2010 was the Tea Party election, so that was one of the reasons a lot of people turned out, and certainly the Affordable Care Act was one of the reasons that people were upset. But it was a brand new program, and change is always difficult. I suspect today in the polling that people are a lot more inclined towards liking the Affordable Care Act. Certainly it's been on death's door legally and otherwise several times, but it's managed to survive. And I think there's more general support for it now. That's not necessarily true here in Tennessee, at least not politically. We don't seem to be anywhere close to being able to expand our Medicaid program in to include the Obamacare. And so it's still an issue, but I think it's probably a program better well received and thought about than it was back 10 years ago.
The Affordable Care Act is definitely more favored now than it was in 2010. And I think actually in Tennessee, recent polls have shown that most Tennesseans actually support the Affordable Care Act and are in favor of Medicaid expansion despite our leaders' unwillingness to adopt it. So I think older adults, as they become more familiar with how the provisions of the Affordable Care Act have benefited older adults, specifically with protections for people with pre-existing conditions when they have to buy coverage on their own. Also, the improvements that the Affordable Care Act made to Medicare, including reduced costs for prescription drugs and closing the Medicare prescription drug donut hole. So as older adults realize that they've benefited from the Affordable Care Act, I think they will be compelled to go out into the polls and vote along the lines of protecting that important legislation.
To just amplify and lift up what Kenita just said, it also underscores the importance of elections, not just at the federal level, but at the state level, because we do have statewide polls that show that way more than half of the Tennesseans would support Medicaid expansion in the state, yet it's not even close when it's been discussed in the General Assembly. So to me, that argues that seniors and everyone need to pay way more attention to the local elections. And once we get through this presidential election, pay excruciating attention to redistricting so that we have representatives that are representative of us for the next 10 years.
The Republicans in the legislature have been very good at being able to take the issue and turn it into not Affordable Care Act, but Obamacare, and turn it into, you didn't like President Obama, you didn't vote for him in this state, you don't want to do Obamacare because it's not going to be financially feasible, even though it's been going on for 10 years now, it has not gone broke, and the state has forfeited several $1 billion that could have been used in health care in the state. So far, the Democrats and others have not been able to turn the focus on what Tennessee is missing out of this and make the voters understand the connection between who's in their state legislature and why they don't have expansion of the Medicaid program.
Yeah, all right. Well, let's talk about what I feel like is going to be a really huge mark of this election, which is the mechanics of voting, how we're going to vote, the situation of the pandemic, how that's going to affect folks. What do people need to know about the approaching deadlines, about the rules for how voting can happen, who can apply for absentee ballots, to what extent absentee ballots are going to play a big role in this election? Let's dig into that aspect of the conversation and start off with, I guess the thing we need to know is the deadline to register to vote, which is coming up quickly. Correct, Marian?
Yes, the deadline to register to vote is October 5th. And remember, if you have moved across county lines, you have to re-register to vote. If you're not sure of your voter registration status, you can go to govotn.gov and check your registration status. You can also go there to register online if you have a Tennessee license, and if not, you can download the form. But it has to be in the mail by October 5th. As I'm on a roll, let me just say, the league would say, make a plan to vote and then go vote. So you have 3 ways you can vote. If you're eligible, you can vote absentee by mail. And if you're 60 or over, you can vote absentee by mail. But you have to apply for that absentee ballot. And that has to be in by, I think it's October 27th, but that's way too late. If you're going to vote absentee by mail, apply now, because we all heard about the post office and the delays in the mail and how long it's going to take. If a new wrinkle this time is if you have fear of COVID, you have an underlying special vulnerability to it, you are now eligible to vote absentee by mail. If you're a caretaker for somebody with a special vulnerability to COVID, you can vote absentee by mail. A word about voting absentee by mail: make sure you get it there in time and make sure you follow the directions. If you forget to sign the affidavit, your vote will not count. If you and your spouse mix up the ballots and sign the wrong envelope, your vote won't count.
Yeah, Marian, talk a little bit about what lessons did we learn from the August primaries about how many ballots were not counted, how successful was absentee voting during the August primaries?
Personally, from the league's perspective, absentee voting by mail was pretty successful. There was a lot of concern ahead of time about how long it was going to take to count the votes, that it would be weeks. Well, it might have been till the next day, but pretty much the election officials did a good job of preparing for the onslaught of many, many more absentee ballots. Of course, there are always some that don't get counted. The vast majority, I don't have numbers on how many didn't get counted. I think in Davidson County it was in the hundreds, less than 500. Most of those were because they were late. And there's nothing election officials can do about a late absentee ballot. And then the rest were mostly because people didn't sign the affidavit, or I think there was one case where a husband and wife switched and signed the wrong affidavit, and that those can't be accepted. And if you put two ballots in the same affidavit envelope, they won't be counted. They won't be counted either.
There's one wrinkle about voting absentee by mail that I'd like to mention, and that is for people who are residing in nursing homes or assisted living facilities or other types of congregate settings. They can only vote absentee by mail if they are residing in a facility outside of the county where they registered to vote. For others, they are required to follow the process that's laid out in Tennessee statute, and Tennessee is one of 32 states that provide for assistance at nursing homes. So under the law, each county election commission is supposed to deputize someone to go in and conduct the absentee voting process. But we know COVID-19 has disrupted that procedure because there are restrictions on visitors to these facilities. So there is a concern that nursing home residents may not have as much access to the voting process. Right now, the workaround for that is that the state has allowed the county election commissions to deputize 2 workers inside each nursing home to oversee voting at the facilities. And those are facilities that are closed to visitors, and that is the case in 52 counties in Tennessee. They are not allowing outside visitors to their facilities, and so that means that nursing home workers are having to take on that responsibility to conduct the absentee voting process there. It's unfortunate that we did not pursue the simplest and safest solution, which would be to allow all nursing home residents to do absentee voting by mail. But it appears that doing the simplest and safest thing in 2020 is too much to ask.
A couple of things to add, I think, about getting it back to the Election Commission. You cannot take it to the Election Commission yourself. They will not accept it. In a lot of states, they have what are called drop boxes, like a mailbox where you can take it and drop it off there somewhere on a public street. You can't do that in Tennessee. There are no drop boxes. The U.S. mail is one way to do it, but you can also use delivery services, UPS, FedEx, other people like that. They can get it to you there. I also believe in a pinch you can take it directly to the downtown post office and get it delivered late, but I wouldn't count on that, particularly with the amount of volume you're going to get this year. If you've got it voted, you know what you're going to do for voting, get it done early and get it back.
All right, let's go over again. These are some of the key dates to remember. We need to register to vote by October 5th. And then in Tennessee, you can request an absentee ballot as late as 7 days before the November 3rd general election. However, if you wait until then, it's questionable whether you'll be able to get that ballot in time to fill it out and get it back by the deadline to vote. So how soon can people request an absentee ballot in Tennessee?
You can request your ballot now. I know I've already got my application in and I'm waiting to get my ballot back out. We shouldn't forget that you can also vote in person. You can vote early, and that starts October 14th. And of course, you can vote on Election Day. We would encourage you to vote early to avoid the lines. And just as in the August primary, there will be all of the same precautions being taken with the poll workers in PPE, et cetera, and voters being asked to please wear masks to protect themselves and others.
Where is the best place to go to find out sort of a list of these dates and the rules in a concise place where you can kind of figure out the path for you to be able to vote in Tennessee?
To find out whether you're registered to vote and the official information, you can go to the state of Tennessee's govotetn.gov. It takes you to the Secretary of State's website, but it's very easy to remember, govotetn.gov.
All right, so lastly, let's kind of take a stab at what are your thoughts? How prominent will a role will absentee voting play in this election?
I think absentee voting by mail, particularly, will be a lot more popular this year because of COVID-19 and the reasonable fear, especially among older adults who are twice as likely to contract the virus and are really susceptible to it and have higher death rates. They are afraid of going out and exposing themselves in that way. So absentee voting is really important this election season, and I think a lot of older adults will be taking advantage of that option.
I think in Tennessee, we will probably know who's won this state in terms of the presidential election on election night, because I think the margin is going to be big enough for the president. It's not going to be a problem. Nationwide, that's not going to be true. In fact, if the polling's correct about how people plan to vote, it appears that Trump voters are more likely to vote day of or early vote. Biden voters are more likely to vote by absentee, by mail. That means on election night, you may see numbers coming out in states that are not necessarily the way you thought they'd turn out, and it may look like the president is in the lead that night. Over the next several days, maybe weeks, before all the mail ballots are valid, it could start changing. That could put us in a little bit of a position, not just in Florida, which we had in 2000, but in states all across the country where people start calling one another sore losers and start getting into court. Lots of other things that are going to be really a little bit concerning, particularly when we've already got all the unrest in the country as there is. So it's going to be a very different election night. I always love election night because you stay up late and you find out what happened. You cook more popcorn, have more fun. I don't think we're going to find out much election night nationally, and maybe not in a lot of the Senate races either. So it's going to be an interesting situation.
I just think that's such an important point that, one of the things that's going to change this year is that election night isn't going to be a one-night affair. It's going to be a long, drawn-out affair. It's going to be perhaps a week, several weeks until all the votes are counted. I mean, it's very important in an election like this. In our polling, we've seen that the polls are very close. Every vote needs to count, and it is the most important right that we have as Americans. So we're going to make sure that the votes are counted. It's going to take a while. People should just be ready for that this is going to be different than it's ever been before.
And I was just going to add that circumstances are relevant. Again, as I'd said earlier, there not only are older individuals concerned about the safety of voting, but caregivers. We know we have over 1 million caregivers in Tennessee who are caring for somebody who is older or a person with disability. We also know that before the pandemic, we had 77,000 grandparents taking care of grandchildren. So all levels of generation in a household who are concerned about the pandemic and voting safely. And so I appreciate Marianne covering all of the options and ways that you can vote safely, as well as early voting in person.
Well, we've run out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us, and thank you for watching. I hope this conversation has helped you prepare to participate in the 2020 election. To learn more about NPT's Aging Matters series, visit our website, wnpt.org/agingmatters. Thanks.
Major funding for Aging Matters is provided by the West End Home Foundation, enriching the lives of older adults through grant-making, advocacy, and community collaboration. The Jeanette Travis Foundation, dedicated to improving the health and well-being of the Middle Tennessee community. The HCA Foundation, on behalf of TriStar Health. Cigna, together all the way. Additional funding provided by Jackson National Life Insurance Company, the Community Foundation of Middle Tennessee, and by members of NPT. Thank you.